I want to look at the idea of content studio and brand story. One of the difficulties that I kind of face with this presentation is I can't really talk about any of the projects I've done because my clients wouldn't necessarily want me to do that. Also, one of the other things I guess I should kind of point out is that clients tend to come to me when they've got a problem that they haven't been able to solve in-house. So again, it's kind of sometimes a little difficult for me to kind of frame that conversation to a wider audience that doesn't look bad for the brand to some extent. But what I'm going to discuss a little bit is the idea of how you can take brand story and bring it into your content studio. It's just a couple of slides, a couple of images of projects that I have actually completed. And Louise, who's going to be discussing things later with Zalando, will kind of flesh out some of these things, I think, a little bit more. I think that's really it in terms of kind of photos that I'll be able to show of projects. You may be able to kind of ask me some questions and I can see if I can answer them later for you, though. So one of the things that I want to really discuss is that how the brand story should be really integral to the design that you make within a studio. It should be really integral to the process that you develop. So when I think about brand story, what I think about is how, as a customer, how easy is it to return the product? How easy is it to order the product? How easy is it to get information? And how can we bring that kind of process into the content studio? Which is something that a lot of brands don't necessarily consider. I think one of the things also to think about when we're kind of talking about brand story and about studio is people's experience of the studio, and the studio is a kind of an outlier. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the time that a huge amount of work goes into the head office, making it a flagship studio, a flagship building. And for example, I've been invited to meetings at head office where you walk through the kind of atrium and go to the cafeteria and you go up in a glass elevator and you go to the boardroom, and then you go to the studio and it's on an industrial site somewhere because it's just cheap or it's easy or it's where the lorries go to. I think that one of the things that we need to kind of discuss when we look at the idea and the concept of studio design is like, how does that compare to the effort that people put into a head office? One of the other things also that I kind of detail is the idea of head office having a really clear structure, but the studio again, and I kind of hear it a lot of the time from the way that people talk even in the panel, for etc., about how to problem solve. It's like, well, we're problem solving ourselves. There isn't this kind of necessary organization and process in place when the studio was designed. The other thing I guess that I want everyone to consider is if you have direct contact with the in-house studio, how easy is that communication process? Was it just a sort of a bolt-on? Was the studio something that just arrived later? Or is it something that's really integral in the way that the brand speaks and communicates internally? The other thing also to kind of discuss with that in terms of ease of use and ease of working a brand story is like, how does that work for the teams within the studio? Do they feel a part of a team? Do they feel a part of a communication system? Do they feel a part of an ability that the brand is trying to problem solve? Or again, is it an outlier that they need to kind of develop their own systems within house? One of the other things also to consider, I guess, with studio, and I think the ASOS talk was really informative and really helpful for this because ASOS do this amazingly well, is the idea, how do you convey to the people, the creatives, the team, the models, that this is what we're about, this is the fundamental being of us behind the brand, and can you do that with the studio space? And really, can you do it physically with the studio space as well? What do you feel when you walk in the door? What are you met with? What do you see in the way of kind of reception and imagery, and how fluid and efficient is that whole design? The other thing also, which I kind of get onto a little bit later, is the idea that there will become a point where you have to show more and more of the studio, where your customer will kind of be in the studio. They may physically be in the studio, and we'll see some examples of that with Zalando later. But also just the fact that almost no part of your studio will be off limits anymore. You'll have to start live streaming and showing different content from all aspects of the studio. So it's something to consider when you're designing a studio space. And the thing that I guess motivates that is that we're constantly blurring the boundaries and the lines that divide the brand and the customer. The customer wants to know so much more about the brand, and they want to feel a part of the brand. And again, this was touched on in the ASOS talk. It's like, how do we communicate that? But how do we really bring the customer into the community? And the studio being an actual, really integral part of selling that brand story. Sometimes there's a disconnect. So this is an actual conversation. Well, it's not a conversation. This is a quote that I had from someone. I was brought in to kind of fix their studio. I won't tell you who the brand was. It's no one that's in the room. It was a very iconic brand, though. And one of the first things I wanted to do was just find out, well, what did the creative director think of the studio? And that's what they thought of the studio. So there's often this disconnect of what can be achieved with a studio and how closely creative want to work with it. This isn't necessarily the same for all kind of digital-first brands, but brands particularly that had bricks and mortar stores as well, tend to put all their resource into the campaign, and then they forgot about the studio because they just thought it was kind of a PDP. I've got this image of office design also, but I'm a fan of architecture. But what I want to kind of get across is the idea that we've got 80 years at least, I mean way more than that because that's not the first office that was ever designed, but of really beautiful office design where people have gone to experts, they've gone to architects, they've gone to space planners, they've gone to flow, process people and said, how can we build and how can we make a good studio? But we've got 80 years of learning. We've also got over 40 years of understanding tools. So when you walk into an office, you should have a similar kind of experience, which is very different to what you would have if you walk into a studio because you'll see that they all operate very differently. I grabbed this image off LinkedIn because one of the things also that I kind of noticed that when you're scrolling on LinkedIn is I've never seen this kind of picture from someone starting in a studio. Maybe you have, and maybe it's a common thing. But I find that when you onboard someone from other departments to head office, for example, they get a pack, they get an understanding of what it's like to be onboarded there. They get, day 1 through to day 6, or however long it takes to onboard people, whereas that isn't necessarily an approach that a lot of studios have. And I think this also came from the panel earlier of how do you bring people on board? How do you help them problem solve? How do you teach them some of the skills that they want to have? But at head office, we should have that as an established way of working. Also with this in a minute, we have a lot of focus, like I said, on the idea of head office, the head office having a structure, it being very planned, it normally having kind of workflows and systems in place, tools in place, budgets in place. My experience a lot of the time with in-house studios is this is the sort of org chart that someone will give me. I've exaggerated a little bit, but it's very diverse. It spreads out in lots of different ways. And there's always this conversation, oh, well, creatives do this and ops do this. And I know it's hard to plan a studio, but it's not normally thought out in the same way that a head office is. You also, I'm going to move away, you also have this sort of person over there that tends to know everything about the studio, and they're the person that everyone goes to problem solve things, rather than that being, say, a process excellence team. Which is, again, one of the difficulties when you're designing an in-house studio and when you're planning it, is that the org chart just keeps growing all the time through different job roles that develop, and it's not built with this kind of clear understanding at the beginning. And in terms of product flow, I think you've probably all experienced something like this, that you'll get really good in the studio at doing one type of product, and then the creative team will come in and say, okay, we've got a new idea, we're going to give you this way of shooting now, can you go away and solve that? And then suddenly over 3 or 4 years, you've just bolted on all these different ways of shooting product, and you've got so many different processes in place. And maybe no one has kind of stepped back and said, okay, how do we fundamentally change all these processes and streamline them? The other thing also with this is a lot of the experience that I have is that people at tech companies in particular, they don't want to necessarily go and outsource something if there's a better system. They just want to develop it in-house, which means that they give you something, but then the creative team asks for a different way of shooting, and then suddenly you're bolting something onto the process again, and it all becomes really complicated. The other thing also to consider with this is that buildings evolve, and studios are really living spaces. And often the first thing I do if I go to a studio is I'll walk around at 3 in the afternoon, and you can literally see the bottlenecks. You'll see where everything is just breaking up in the studio because the building kind of talks to you in a certain way. And for me, that's always really helpful to see, well, has someone designed this in a process way? Have they understood how product moves through in the same way that how digital processes work through? And it's often a real gap in the knowledge base of the studio design. And the reason for this a lot of the time is that studios have grown organically. You know, it may be that the studio started off shooting on mannequin and it had 5 sets and it was very good at doing that. And then the product started to sell and suddenly they needed to add more sets. And then someone came in and said, well, let's start shooting on model. And then a little bit later, someone was like, well, how do we shoot model but more creatively? And then you've got 3 or 4 different types of set design, for example, that are moving through the studio space. And because you can't ever really stop, as we know, because it's e-commerce, you can't strip everything out and start again with a set that does all of these things for you. This is kind of one example of where I took a project to. And hopefully this will be brought out in another conversation a little bit later. But one of the challenges in this space was, you can see a styling closet on the left-hand side. And the brief that was given to me by the client, which was really helpful and really useful, was like, let's try and make it more like a store. Let's try and make it as if it's a customer-facing place so that the stylists feel like they're actually stylists. They feel like there's a love for the product and they can walk into a space and they can see all the product from the outside, and they get a real sense of belonging to the brand and being stylists. The bottom set of imagery, again, that was the brand responding really quickly, and they were solving all the problems that they needed to do. But you can see from that the sets aren't designed in a way that's actually compatible to working efficiently. You had to walk up a big step, you had to duck under a light, you had to do loads of things that if you're doing it 300 times a day would be really frustrating. The studio team, were just trying to solve a problem. But the element of design that I want to kind of get across is, can you take some breathing space? Can you step back and can you decide, okay, what does the studio really need to do? What does a content set look like? Can it shoot stills and video? Does it need to? Does it need to have movement in it in, a year's time? The other thing also, that these are all genuinely things that people have said to me. A lot of the time I'll go into a studio and they say, yeah, but we used to have head office and we would shoot in a department store that we didn't need 1 floor of it, or, well, we kind of converted the space and it was okay at the time. And a lot of clients are always just looking back. They're never looking forward to the future, going, what's the best studio that I can design, and how do I make the studio as effective as possible? Now, the key to this is not just about making your team engaged. I think it's about, why is this super important? And like I said at the beginning, it's the idea for me that the customer will be in the studio. And I really mean also potentially a physical presence in the studio. And you'll see it in a lot of brands at the minute that are starting to, shoot more with influencers, etc. But I see that that's going to kind of trickle down, and actually it's going to be more just your kind of everyday customer that is potentially going to be having a studio experience in some way as you introduce more, say, diversity into your model range. So we need to be designing a space that is compatible for that. The other thing also is that this sense of community will continue to grow, especially post-COVID. And we need to kind of lean on the idea that our in-house studio teams are experts. They understand the product and they should be able to understand how to communicate to the audience. And to do that to make that happen, we really need to open up the space and create this idea of entertaining shopping experiences. I have some kind of slides. Some of you may be familiar with some of this information. But the idea that post-COVID things changed, and they changed really significantly in the way that we should look at community and the idea of hyper-local selling to people. And the studio is a really fantastic way of doing that, and the idea of connecting with your audience is really important. You saw a lot of brands that were able to pivot really quickly during COVID, and there was a lot of learnings from that, and hopefully we can build that into studio design. The other thing also is to consider this top line with this, that in terms of Gen Z, what Gen Z think and how they believe brands should be, is really understanding that they are super driven by ethics and ethos. And actually we should be creating spaces that our employees are really happy to work in, that they're really motivated. It's a space that works for them. And as that conversation continues and opens up, if you have a studio that's really dysfunctional, that will start to kind of become part of the conversation. And we have to be really careful that we're providing spaces that, like I say, are engaging and interesting for your teams. again, with this, one of the things that changed with COVID is the idea that you can talk to small clusters. When everyone was locked down, and I live in Berlin, and we had a really strict lockdown, and maybe you did in the city that you come from as well, but suddenly everything became super localized, and it became about, who do you speak to in the sort of literally 2 or 3 blocks that you're allowed to walk around. And this will, I feel, continue in the way that we start to market to people. And so fashion brands should start to kind of put a lot more focus on the local market. And one of the ways that they can start to do that is open up the idea of the studio. And I'll get to where I think this can lead to in a minute. The other thing is also to kind of listen intently to what consumers are saying about themselves. And if you think, I presume everybody probably in this room has Instagram. Everybody thinks of themselves as a content creator now, which they are. And if you think of the kind of quality of imagery that you see nowadays from influencers, from just kind of regular people, not photographers, where the image standard is super high. It's really good. People are really focused on how they can build brilliant imagery and make themselves into a brand. And there's a danger that studios will be left behind by that because they have such fixed formulaic way of working because they need to, because of process, and they need to get product through quickly. But we have to be careful that our customers aren't making better imagery than we're capable of making. So one of the things that came out of the shutting down of stores was the idea that how can we increase interaction through e-commerce? Can we have a sales associate that is able to speak directly to the customer? And a lot of brands sort of managed to pivot and do this quite quickly. One of these examples here with Gucci Live is the idea that you can directly connect. And thinking about this in kind of a more abstract way, we've got all these stylists within studios, like I said, that really understand the product. They see the product every day. They style it with brand adjacencies. They understand how this can kind of work for a client. And is there a way in the future that we can open this up, that your stylists become your sales assistants, essentially? As we continue to elevate the idea of content, and it's not just kind of straightforward PDP imagery, if we build on the idea of short videos, live streaming, your stylists are going to have to become sort of personable people. And that's a real opportunity for the brand to exercise something interesting in the way of direct contact with their customers. So I want to kind of imagine an idea where we have multiple studios, not just a big kind of flagship studio, but multiple studios spread around a territory that essentially become sales hubs, where your stylists have an idea that they can speak and they can convey something to the community that's out there. And it's already happening. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is like, well, how much does that empower people? How much does it empower your team? But also, how much does it open you up to the fact that maybe you didn't set the studio up in a really good way? Because to do this, you have to have really amazing process in place. You have to have really good workflows. You have to have sets that deliver everything you want to do in an economic and creative way. And you have to really dial down on the idea of process flow within the studio space. And taking this a little bit further, can you imagine a scenario where we design studios that the customer can just walk in? And it's like being in a store. You get that branded feel that you can, there's wayfinding, there's signage. You can understand how you can get to a model set if you want to. You can see in the styling closet. And just really open up this idea that the studio can be a space that really represents the brand. The reason also, like I said, that I think that this is super important is that PDP is changing, and I've got a couple of examples from Zalando, just taken from their live website as well, of how they've moved really smoothly and quickly away from the idea of models in the studio. And first of all, maybe it was influencers, and it was user-generated content to some extent. And now it's really a sense of community. And a lot of that content shooting is able to occur in the studio. And it's kind of one of the main ideas behind how we can actually design studios and make a representative space for people. The danger of that also is if you think, okay, we're going to bring customers into the studio, it's kind of a scary thought in some ways, because maybe they're just met with loads of people that complain like the tools don't work and the system isn't great and I don't have a good way of showing my product and I hate the styling closet, for example. And we have to be really careful that we're creating jobs for people that they feel empowered by, and that we're giving them the tools that they can actually kind of use to enhance their own career and experience as well. The final thing, I've got a couple more slides, I'm going to try and go quite quickly through this, is the idea that how can we also then bring this back into store? Can we create mini studios in stores? Can we open up the opportunity that a customer can go in, style some product, and find themselves on the PDP by just shooting in a booth, for example, that's in the store? And again, to do that, we have to have really good systems in place, process systems, review systems, a way that maybe a creative director can see that imagery and say, yeah, let's put that straight onto the PDP pages. The reason also with this is that we're going to see an increasing amount of ideas of going into small stores. COVID obviously shut down so many places. There's a lot of empty stores. There's a lot of places that could be reappropriated as studio spaces. And the interesting thing about this is that you can create this idea of a social space within a studio that, you know, a customer that doesn't necessarily feel spoken to by the PDP can grab a couple of friends and they can come into the studio and they can make content and they see themselves within your brand. I've kind of illustrated this a little bit from one of my experiences with a large client. So they had this huge market, and at the beginning, they had a couple of studios spread out all across Europe. And what they wanted to do was obviously get the product in really quickly, photograph it, get it back out, so they had to have the studios spread out. Then they realized, well, actually, we aren't getting the same quality of imagery that we should have because each studio is responding a little differently. They have different ways of doing things. As we've heard from some of the teams, they have different processes in place. So then they had to build a flagship studio. That flagship studio started to spread out to the territory and had a really tight control of the imagery because, you know, a couple of years ago, everything was about consistency. Then you start to bring influencers into that. So they come into the studio process, and there's a dilution of the control that the studio has. And that's very deliberate at that point. But then something really interesting for me starts to happen. And I see this in a lot of social media feeds at the minute, that the influencers or user-generated content, they start talking to each other. They're not talking with the brand in any way now. The channels are just, you know, I got this from this brand, and I'm live streaming this, and another influencer will work with them. And the community spread is what's driving this kind of brand knowledge and brand story. What this leads to is that the super studio that you've built is then not producing the same amount of content that it used to. And you've got, you know, let's say you've built 30 sets, but you're outsourcing everything to influencers and user-generated content. You've suddenly got 10 sets that are available each time. And we have this opportunity now to take the flagship studio, not destroy it, but take it and spread it back out into the kind of smaller community studios that we had at the beginning. Creating community studio hubs. And like I said, this could start in a really small way. It could be actually you're in-store and there's a PDP booth that, you know, is a very small setup, and you go in and you scan your product that you want to wear on a, you know, barcode, you take a photograph of it, it goes through the studio's normal system of being uploaded, and eventually there's a possibility that it can come out onto the PDP. Like I said, the reason for this is that Gen Z are the best image makers that I think we've ever seen because they're so used to it. They grew up with it, and the idea of creating content for themselves is something that has always been with them. So what I want to do, just very quickly, is consider the two parts. Consider the idea that the studio can be a customer-centric place and that you have to be able to bring the customer into the building. And then the second one is the idea of creating these studio hubs within retail stores and creating this kind of retail hybrid that someone is able to come in, feel a part of the brand, make content for themselves, potentially, if it fits your brand story, upload it to the PDP. Last two slides. And this is an example, like I said, of I took this from Zalando's website, from just images that were live last week. And you can see with this the idea that the brand has not lost control, but it's given a lot of control out to its customers, which for me is really forward thinking. And if you think a lot of those images on the left-hand side would probably not have passed quality control or content control maybe 2 years ago for almost any brand, because they're underexposed or the background's too messy or disorganized and so on. But this is the kind of content that customers want to see and are responding to. And again, this is also from Zalando's website. The idea that this is the future. Why at the minute do we necessarily, which I think is a good idea of saying people go and make their own content, but why do they have to make it in their own territory and space? Why do we not open up the studio in a way that they feel welcome and that they can come into the studio and they can engage with stylists, they can engage with the idea that they feel a sense of community and a part of the brand, and we can create these really super important hubs within the studio. That was my last slide.
Great. Questions for Kevin? Rob.
Hi, Kevin. Regarding the user-generated content, I assume they would have to agree to some sort of user agreement, right, beforehand?
Sure. I mean, with this also, I'm kind of projecting this idea forward, but a lot of people want to. They want to be seen in the brand story. They want to see themselves in that mirror image of the brand. I don't think getting permission will be anything difficult. If you think of the systems that have been built within, even the knowledge base in this room, that there should be a really quick way of getting approval for things.
Additional questions? Awesome. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.